For the past 5 months, I have been in hiding. There is a group of higher beings that are after me for discovering information not really meant for me, and I don't mean the CIA, but rather these ancient beings called the Vrilya. Let me tell you all about it from the beginning. It all started in 2010 when I was about 6 years old. I had this opportunity given to me by one of my brothers to try out the secret game mode called Zombies in the all too popular Call of Duty series. As a kid, only really played Midnight Club 3 and Halo 3 for the most part. I was intrigued, and so I decided it was about time I try out a new experience in Kino. Aiding me, he joined me in split screen as we made our way through the rounds, mostly by camping in the staircase in whatever corner we could find, but at a good round 7, it was time for him to go to school. And so I was left all alone in this decrepit theater as silence permeated through my then empty house, leaving me alone with my thoughts. And also the rotting corpse of player 2, but that's not really dramatic, so I didn't make it far. I lasted all but 2 minutes, which is not only a problem for her, but also a problem for me because I didn't really get a chance to discover the theater in its entirety, you see. My nerves simply got the best of me. In retrospect, it wouldn't have been a problem at all. In fact, sitting here hiding in this musty basement, I wish I could have left well enough alone. I went back numerous times thereafter playing solo. When the brain is all but 6 years into development, it wouldn't really have the capability to make sense of the subtle details left around this map. I've already discussed how I would always brace myself, aiming to reach the dogs round at the very least, only to end up quitting the game afterward feeling utterly creeped out. However, I did end up building a slight tolerance after a couple games. Enough to really wander around the map and make sense of it all. I was already mesmerized by the spectacle of this haunted theater, you see, but it wasn't the dusty curtains, the creaking floorboards, nor the subtle chimes of the chandelier that fully caught my attention. Rather, it was the vats on the stage, containing the decaying bodies of what appeared to be these strange beings, quite distinct from the zombies I was familiar with at that point. Seeing these peculiar, otherworldly remains happened to be the biggest mistake of my life. Aside from the time I tried to make homemade fried chicken and lost my reproductive organs in the process, of course. You see, as time went on, I ended up entrenching myself further and further into the lore and mysteries surrounding this game mode. At the time, there was none of that Apothicon and Keeper bullshit introduced almost a decade later. The only thing people could do was theorize and make sense of what the lore did give us. The themes of Nazi experimentation with Group 935 perpetrating it all was always at the forefront. One could have easily looked at the vats and just chalked it up to that and called it a day. I, for one, wish I did so, but there was always more nuance to it than just that. You see, in the initial lore, the main hook was always that this research group came across these meteors that fell from outer space, noting that they seemed to hold strange ethereal powers. Dubbing them Element 115, they proceeded to use its powers to aid the Nazis in World War II. However, this isn't the only manifestations of the Nazis' fascination with the occult. In fact, the Nazis have always had a long-standing affiliation with the supernatural in real life, believing that its power could aid them in the war effort. Now, it might have been the crystal meth Hitler was known for abusing, probably the crystal meth, most likely the crystal meth, but he always had a fascination with the mystic Aryan race and their alleged supremacy, a variation of an idea which can be mostly traced back to a prominent Austrian figure, Guido von List, who was a revivalist of ancient Germanic pagan traditions and chiefly contributed to a branch within the Ariosophy ideology that came into full effect later. You see, Ariosophists believed in the so-called quote-unquote ancient wisdom of the Indo-Aryan race that inhabited lands around modern-day Iran and northern India in prehistoric times. List believed in the purported superiority of this race and the importance of their spiritual and mystical traditions that have been lost over time. He claimed to have rediscovered some of these traditions, with some mystical moon runes that are said to have appeared to him in a dream. I do believe somebody forgot to take their meds for real. Shortly after World War I, the Thule Society was formed in Germany, focusing on esotericism and the occult. Some members of the society were interested in the idea of an ancient Aryan civilization that had once existed in the north, believing that they held advanced knowledge and technology. They saw themselves as descendants of this civilization and believed that they were destined to reclaim this lost knowledge and build a new so-called purified world order. Other members, of course, saw themselves as the true inheritors of the Aryan legacy and believed they were superior to other races and were destined to rule the world. Now, how this plays into effect in the war has to do with the fact that there were a couple of people in this society that will later become prominent Nazi leaders, and also to do with the fact that this society sponsored the German Workers' Party. Party, which none other than Hitler joined about a year or so later, with the party renamed to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or simply the Nazi Party. Now, as the Nazi Party gained more power, the SS and Heinrich Himmler had a division called the unravel formed, based around these topics of ancient cultures and practices in support of the war effort. This think tank was tasked to promote racial absurdities and doctrines, fostering the idea that Germans are the pure descendants of an Aryan race superior to other racial groups, replacing the idea of Indo-Aryans entirely. And while it's a common thing to assume that they instead went with a stereotypical image associated with Aryans, but with white skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes, you didn't really need any of those features to be Aryan in their definition. As long as you were Germanic and definitely not Jewish or Slavic, then no crimes would necessarily be committed against you. Racial typology was a big thing in that they believed each so-called quote-unquote race had a distinct separate branch in evolution, and certain quote-unquote races are inferior to others. An idea dating back to the 18th century, with certain figures the likes of Christoph Meiners, whom the Nazis look up to in terms of intellectualism. How do they determine which race is which? Well, by looking at physical factors, of course. Really, the entire idea of distinct races goes against modern science, and has always been a method to promote inequality and eugenics. The majority of genetic differences are found within an ethnic group than between. We are all really one interconnected species with one common origin point in the end. Regardless, Himmler, with these ideas at hand, later went on to become one of the people most directly responsible for the Holocaust. It caused mass genocides of millions of Jewish people, millions of Polish people, hundreds of thousands of Roma people, and countless people who were queer in any sort of way, whether it be non-conformative gender identities or sexuality, prisoners of war, and also disabled in any capacity, among a myriad of other victims. Anyone they saw a threat to their white supremacist state would become a victim. So as far as esotericism and the occult goes, even with the ideas having a place in the beginning of the Nazi movement, they still mainly use those ideas to justify and define absurd racial identities and nationalism. However, that did not stop the rise of conspiracy theories popping up after the 50s, what with bringing up the all too well-known event where Hitler communed with extraterrestrial aliens and traded UFO schematics. Of course, the sheep of this day and age never acknowledge the spirited expose. Now, one of the all too popular conspiracy theories mainly center around the idea of the Vril-Ya Society. There is a popular concept called the Hollow Earth, which stems from both old mythology and scientists from notably the 18th century. The concept revolves around there being a vast interior realm within the Earth that could be grounds for civilization. It's a popular notion in a bunch of different mythologies and folklore. It pops up as the Greek underworld for one. Now, you might remember reading about the myth of Orpheus, whose lover Eurydice died after a bite she got from a snake. Struck with grief, he goes to this cave known to be the entrance to the underworld to plead with Hades and retrieve her, with it resulting in Hades allowing him to take Eurydice out so long as he doesn't look back at her until they're fully out, which he fails to do so. In a possible parallel warning against the pitfalls of human curiosity. It also pops up in the Hebrew Bible, what with Sheol, described as a sort of purgatory for all souls, good or bad, to end up in, with many scholars interpreting it to be a dark, gloomy place deep beneath the earth. With it being a popular notion in all things mythology and folklore, it eventually led to this book published in 1871 by Edward Bulwer Lytton, titled The Coming Race. It centers around this mysterious, powerful energy dubbed Vril, and the advanced alien civilization deep within the earth that harnesses it. Now, the term Vril is probably not too unfamiliar, seeing as how it pops up numerous times in the Zombies lore, but with the Vril device and the aptly named VR11, which is arguably leet speak for the same word. The concept of Vril as an all-too-powerful life energy is actually one that is ancient. It pops up in several cultures and folklore, such as prana in Hindu culture as a sort of life force that can be harnessed, with references dating back to as much as 3,000 years ago, and Seithr in Old Norse mythology, which, while admittedly is a general term for the practice of prophetic and fate-changing magic, it still deals with utilizing natural energies, which isn't all too dissimilar, albeit more nuanced. The Coming Race kind of puts a stamp on that concept in a tale that starts off with this American man who had a friend working as an engineer. This friend extends him an invitation to this mine he found to be interesting, convinced it held a vast amount of valuable mineral deposits, the likes of which no one had ever seen before, and he wanted him to come along and explore it. Now, agreeing with his friend, the narrator heads there into the interior of this mine and arrives at the side of the shaft with a chasm that purportedly leads down to such wealth. His friend first descends himself, alone, into the dark chasm in a rickety cage, testing the atmosphere with a safety lamp. Minutes go by. then an hour. The friend finally comes back up, and the narrator notices he has a pale expression on his face and a very disturbed look in his eyes. He merely says the descent seemed unsafe, and he promptly leads the narrator to the other parts of the mine dismissively, eager to move on. The narrator notices his demeanor has completely changed from being quite upbeat and adventurous to unusually reserved and withdrawn. As night came and they settled around a campfire, the narrator finally asks his friend, frankly, what he saw in that chasm. After taking a moment, his friend answers that as he finished his descent and stepped out of the cage, he found himself on a ridge that kept slanting downwards, with darkness permeating it so strongly that his lamp could do nothing. Much to his surprise, however, he saw an ambient light at the end, strong enough that he didn't even need the lamp. Now descending further down into the chasm, he was aghast, finding the ridge to now form a level road illuminated by artificial gas lamps placed at regular intervals. Hearing a hum of human voices in the distance, disturbed at the sheer implications of this discovery, he proceeded to retrace his steps and then reunited with the narrator. Now, hearing all this, the narrator realizes his friend forgot to take his meds for real, but in actuality, he persuades his friend to descend down into the chasm again, but this time together, albeit with a bit of back and forth. The following day, they went back in, and what resulted was a long, treacherous descent that kinda resulted in his friend fucking dying because he slipped on a rock and his rope kinda broke. Hovering over the corpse of his beloved friend, he hears an indescribable hiss behind him. Straining his eyes in the darkness, he sees a large reptilian mass emerge in the distance, infinitely larger than any alligator of our world. The narrator's fight-or-flight instinct kicks in, and ain't no way the human instinct would decide to fight a Lovecraftian dinosaur, so he runs down the valley at utmost speed, taking some time before stopping and returning just to see the body of his friend is now gone. With no other option, he proceeds down the lamplit road toward a large building that he's able to discern in the distance. Building not much different than of the earliest form of Egyptian architecture, supported by giant columns. And then a human emerges out from the building. Or at least he thought it was a human. It ended up being a large ethereal being with a face resembling those of angels. Not necessarily in terms of the human perception of beauty, but rather mathematical symmetry and perfection. The being leads the narrator to some of the leaders of their civilization, where they come as close to killing him as the two half-spheres of the demon core came close before leading to the incident. At this point in the story, it pretty much becomes world building for the next 200 out of 300 pages. I shit you not. The gist of it is that there's an advanced race known as Avrilya that once roamed the earth a couple thousand years ago as creatures as primitive as humans now. They came upon a flood of such dangerous proportions that it led them underground, from which point they built various civilizations. Eventually, the modern powerful form of their civilization could harness this energy called Vril, which could be used for utter destruction by any individual on a level that made war and personal conflicts a thing of the past due to the principle of assured mutual destruction, and also healing of equal proportions. Its energy is said to be one that is softer and healthier than from any fossil fuel or renewable, and is strong enough to animate objects and give them life. The energy is, of course, beyond the limits of human understanding, and only the Vrilya can truly harness it. They harness this energy in the form of weapons that look like staffs, and if any of this sounds familiar, that's because it literally is Lamau my ass off. The main shtick of this race that the author develops is literally taking the patriarchal Andrew Tate-ass concept of society prevalent at the time and flipping it, so that instead of men having all the rights and women having none, it was the opposite. And I'm not entirely too sure whether or not this juxtaposition was meant to be a satirical take to drive home the pitfalls of societies that place too much value in one made-up role or what, but as a matter of fact, this book was written in 1871 after all, and there were admittedly going to be a lot of racial ideas too that aren't really the best. After about 200 pages of world building around this race and their politics, the main hook finally develops, and it's literally one where the narrator has not one, but two of this race's powerful women fall in love with him, and I did get the hint that the author really do be self-inserting like a motherfucker, not gonna lie. Why that ended up being such a hook was to do with the fact that it was illegal, so to speak, for this race to breed with another. It ended up being sort of a commentary on a lot of the traditions of the time, where it was discouraged and outlawed for a person of one race to marry and mix with another. The race accepted him as a guest in the beginning, but the so-called elders of this race who make the laws and everything literally said that they'd burn him alive with the power of Vril itself if we were to agree to any of the women's requests. But at a certain point, they decide that they'll burn him anyway because the princess herself fell in love with the guy. Look, I don't know either, bro. The concept of an ancient, powerful race in a hidden part of the world is an idea that can be mostly traced back to Plato and his account of Atlantis. You see, Atlantis was supposed to be this ancient kingdom on an island that beheld such technological superiority over other races that it practically ruled the world. But due to corruption in its people and the government, the gods cursed them by flooding it entirely in a series of earthquakes and floods. Now, while this mostly served as a parable and a literary device warning against corruption, possibly drawing from Plato's own dissatisfaction with the government in Athens at the time, it eventually led people to actually believe that there was a real Atlantis somewhere. Now, remember when this video was about zombies? Yeah, me neither, bro, but the truth is, it has always been about zombies in one way or another, and it's mostly to do with RICHTOFEN'S grand scheme than anything else. You see, there's a ton more nuance to the zombies lore now with multiple dimensions and shit, but at the time, they certainly weren't thinking of any of that at all. Most of what they could go off of were these myths, legends, and conspiracies. So when it comes to RICHTOFEN'S grand scheme as we knew it in the map Moon, it was a culmination of ideas that took inspiration from numerous sources, both real and mythical. We knew that Group 935 found element 115 to have powers that resulted in both teleportation and reanimation. We knew RICHTOFEN was at odds with the group and mainly Chief Dr. Maxis, who didn't want to focus on teleportation as he wanted, but instead wanted to primarily get funding from the Nazis and work on undead super soldiers. That part of the lore is quite established at this point. You know, the betrayal of Maxis, Samantha, and all. RICHTOFEN used the effects 115 had on the human mind, what with fostering severe schizophrenia and delusions of reality to brainwash notably the three characters we play as in Ultimus. The more theoretical side of things lies in his scheme to enter Agartha and control the undead and reality as we know it. Agartha is simply a mythological term for an ancient kingdom that once existed in the Hollow Earth. But in Zombies, the place is more so in another plane of reality than inside the literal Earth. It's essentially the home of the real Ya in this story and is a place of great power. How the scheme started was at a point before the maps in the story when RICHTOFEN first successfully teleported and found himself near the Aether Pyramid or the MPD. Touching it led to him hearing voices in his head which only got worse with time. Eventually, of course, in trying to teleport Samantha to kill her off with Maxis, she instead finds herself near the MPD 2 where she entered it, assuming control of the Aether. Now, RICHTOFEN wanted to get back to the MPD and open it up so that he could enter it himself, but he knew doing so would require an ungodly amount of energy, an amount that Vril, as he could harness it, couldn't really give. Luckily, he could devise a plan anyway. Enter quantum mechanics. There is an interesting phenomenon that happens when you have two microscopic, uncharged conductive plates held a few nanometers apart in a vacuum, in that for some reason, there happens to be an attractive force in between them. The only principle relevant here should be gravity, but on a scale this small, the effects would be so tiny as to not even be practically measurable. This effect is known as the Casimir effect. Now, vacuum energy, or zero-point energy, describes a mode where virtual particles that basically pop in and out of existence, would dominate in a vacuum, and thus it'd be the lowest possible state of energy. This would then cause an imbalance in the areas between the plates and the areas outside the plates, where more powerful virtual particles would dominate less between the plates due to a lack of available space, therefore causing an attraction as a result of differences in pressure. The catch is that this would only really be measurable when the distance between the plates is extremely small, with the effect producing more than 1 atmosphere of pressure when the distance is but a bunch of nanometers. Now, this approach is more of the classical heuristic approach, whereas the newer approach is just to consider it as a byproduct of van der Waals forces, weak forces that occur between molecules due to temporary imbalances in the distribution of electrons within the molecules, causing one end to have more negative of a charge and the other more positive, with an attraction occurring between two of these molecules. And you're gonna ask me how the fuck this is relevant to the zombie storyline, but all this time, the Zombies team were cooking the zombie storyline, and we might as well consider they were cooking crystal meth, and no one said anything. So at least let me cook for a bit, alright? Now in the map Ascension, the Casimir mechanism was introduced as a concept. It being any type of mechanism that exploits the Casimir effect in any sort of way. The first thing you hear is Dr. Gersh pleading us to repair the Casimir mechanism in order to let him escape what can only be assumed to be the Aether, as he was betrayed by another doctor called Yuri after Bro threw a Gersh device at the motherfucker. The Gersh device itself is a Casimir mechanism. As you might notice, that is literally just two metal plates, and while I don't claim to be an expert in the art of closing a waffle maker and creating ethereal black holes as a result, it is certainly one of the Casimir effects of all time. As powerful as it is, it's not until we shoot like a billion wonder weapons infused with 115 into the Gersh device that there's enough power for a wormhole sustainable enough for Gersh to travel through. One could argue that 115 itself is infused with Vril energy. Now, Richtofen knows he has to harness Vril energy, and he sought the Vril device and called the dead to do so, a device which strikes a parallel to the staves the Rilya held in the coming race. He then sought a highly potent piece of element 115 in Shangri-La called the Focusing Stone, which he shrank down to combine with the Vril device, and even then, the energy combined wouldn't have been enough. He had to harness the Casimir effect and charge the thingamajig he invented, putting the whatchamacallit in between the two plates in the vast vacuum of space on the moon. He harnesses all of its available energy and retrieves the doohickey for what would finally be enough to open the MPD and control the world. After infusing the souls of like 100 people, of course, this design is very human. The exact motive of Richtofen and why he wants to rule the world wasn't exactly ever clear in Black Ops 1, but he did have certain things like the lyrics to this Easter egg song in Call the Dead dictating how he wants to rule the world, and it dictates insanity. That's what it dictates. He felt as if he'd been wronged in not being allowed to chase his dreams at the research facility. That, combined with 115-induced schizophrenia and delusions, combined with hearing the voices of the corrupted Rilya in his head giving him directions on what to do, might have had something to do with it, I bet. The biggest difference between the Rilya in the 1871 book and the Rilya in the games is to do with corruption. In the book, the Rilya are described to live in this supposed utopia where no evil can take place. One of the major points in this book is how boring and harmful the aspect of a utopia really is, at least with the given depiction at hand. There are numerous events in the book where the leaders of the civilization are aghast at hearing the narrator's accounts of human history, with crimes even being a thing. It was such a foreign concept to them that it only was a thing in other alien races in the Hollow Earth that they deemed animal-like. Might be some social commentary in their own prehistoric times, equivalent to our being cavemen. With the way the race was depicted, it was a utopia in which freedom of expression and daring art weren't really ever a thing, and one gender still had less rights because social norms were a thing even there, and child slave labor was also a thing commonly utilized for the betterment of their societies, among other things. But hey, no crime and war, so that's a utopia. Am I right, fellas? Am I right, fellas? Now, in the games, the Rilya were later synonymous with the Keepers, existing before time and space were ever even a thing. Unlike the book, there was corruption between the Keepers, which led to a separate branch in their species called the Apothicons, the elder ones of which have been around since the very beginning. And since corruption is like a Lovecraftian concept which is said to take a toll on their appearance as time goes on, really I almost find it disappointing that the elder Apothicon god in Revelations wasn't like 50 times bigger. And so that was what the community cooked, trying to make sense of it all, before Blundell came and gave us interactive quantum mechanics as steps in his Easter egg quests. The thing that made Black Ops 1 so special to me is how it didn't take itself too seriously. The lore manifested itself in the form of cryptic radios and fan theories, and all we'd do was see which theories the devs would end up running with. It wasn't until Blundell came that there was an effort to make the clusterfuck of ancient beings, time travel, and quantum mechanics actually cohesive. And it wasn't until Black Ops 3 that Blundell and Craig Houston actually had a story written out for the maps to revolve around. Now, there's a lot of people who dislike Black Ops 1 Zombies for its paradoxes regarding time travel and how the execution doesn't make sense, and that you destroy the Earth in a year set before all the other events could ever take place. Mate, you teleport into space and kill zombies. Like, it's not supposed to make sense. To circle back to my current situation, there had been strange happenings in my life ever since I discovered all this information, you see. It would start with little things. A whisper behind me here and there, even though I was alone. Things disappearing around the house. Then I started seeing a strange figure in the corner of my vision. Haters will say I'm not taking my meds, and while I don't deny any of these allegations, I assure you that correlation It's not causation, ladies and gentlemen. It all culminated in the event that led me to run out of my house and into a dark, empty, abandoned house's musty basement. The world has gone cold. I seem to have been placed in purgatory. You see, I woke up one day as usual, and as I was washing my face, I looked up at the bathroom mirror, and